Okay, my name is Ron Carrico. I'm with the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and today we're interviewing Russell Schweikart, the pilot, the LEM pilot for Apollo number 9. That is the Apollo that we have in our museum. So just ask you some simple questions and we'll go from there. So why did you get into aviation in the first place?
Why or when?
Why?
Why? Because I was raised on a farm in New Jersey, and we were probably, I don't know, 25 miles or so north, a little northeast of Lakehurst Naval Air Station. That was during World War II, and overhead every day were fighter planes, Navy fighter planes, dogfighting one another, and I became totally fascinated by aircraft, and in particular fighter planes and flying, and it was just became a very natural thing as a young kid.
So when the war ended, how old were you?
I don't know, subtract from 1935, so I guess I was 10 years old when the war ended.
Do you remember it, when it ended?
Yeah, I do. I remember, you know, big VJ Day and VE Day, and yeah.
And then after that, you went off to college and you went to?
MIT.
And you studied?
Well, I actually entered in chemical engineering because I had a Chemcraft chemistry set up in the attic, and I used to mix all kinds of things, and I thought I liked chemistry. And then I got to MIT and realized I didn't like chemistry. And so halfway through my first year, I switched to aeronautical engineering, which of course was a natural because of my interest in airplanes.
So you went to, what year did you start college and what year did you finish?
Started in '52, ended in '56.
And then you got into the Air National Guard, is that right?
Well, no, I went onto active duty in the Air Force, went through pilot training and became a fighter pilot.
What class were you in?
57U.
Wow. That was, I didn't know the letters got that high.
Yeah, well, they did in those days. I have no idea what the numbers are now. But,
which base did you go to?
Well, I started out in primary training in Bainbridge Air Base in Georgia.
Flying
T-34s and then T-28s.
Okay.
And then from there went to Big Spring in Texas and flew T-33s, and from there on to Williams Airfield, Williams Air Base in Phoenix, or outside of Phoenix.
Right, Chandler.
Yeah, Chandler, right, and flew F-86 Fs, actually, were what we trained in, and then to Nellis Air Base for the brand new F-100.
Oh, wow.
F-100A at Nellis, and that was the last time I flew an F-100 that was fun to fly.
What was that?
Because it didn't have anything hanging under the wings.
Oh, right, sure.
And, you know, the whole philosophy of a fighter plane needs to do everything, you know, the McNamara kind of idea later prevailed. And so after that, you know, I never flew for the next 2 or 3 years or whatever it was. I never flew an F-100 that didn't have all kinds of garbage hanging under the wing, and made it a terrible flying machine.
So of the other astronauts, were any of those guys flying 100s at the same time you were?
Yeah. Seems to me that Dave Scott and several other people were flying them in Europe. I think Dave was flying out of Soesterberg or somewhere in the Netherlands. But I don't really know what the other...
So you didn't know those guys at that time?
No.
Oh, wow.
I don't think... No, I don't think I knew anybody who ended up in my group in the astronaut program.
You were in the third group, right?
Third group, right.
And now, when you graduated, so you must have stayed in for just 4 years and then went to the Guard after that, is that?
I stayed in, let's see, from 56 to 60, yeah, 4 years. I was active duty in the Philippines. I was flying F-100Ds in the Philippines, deploying up to Taiwan every fourth week or so, standing nuclear alert, and all that kind of thing. And after 4 years, I got out and went back to MIT. A little bit of stuff in there, but that's not important. And went back to MIT in graduate school and joined the Mass Air Guard to help pay my way through. You know, I had a growing family at the time, and so I had to hold down 3 jobs, go to school, fly on the weekends, you know.
Yeah, I did.
But the Mass Air Guard was in those days flying out of Logan Airport. Not later. Later on, they moved down to Cape Cod. But in those days, we were flying literally right out of the commercial airfield there at Logan with F-86Hs.
Which a lot of people seem to think that was like the best flying machine.
Absolute best airplane I've ever flown. I mean, that was a great flying machine.
I've talked to some Navy pilots. You might meet one of them tonight.
Yeah, FJs were close.
Yeah,
not as good. Yeah. And the Canadians had a Mark 6 Sabre that was also pretty good.
Oh, wow.
And they became, when Kennedy activated our guard unit and during the Berlin Wall,
oh, right.
and sent us over to Europe, we deployed to Europe.
Where'd you go?
Well, to a base called Fallsburg, which is about 30 clicks or so west of Strasbourg. But we were surrounded by 4 Canadian Air Force bases, and all of them flew Mark 6 Sabres. So the minute you would get off the ground, it was Katie bar the door, you know, it was a free-for-all.
A lot of dogfighting going on.
Hello? We were there 60, 61, but it's same environment. I mean, every kind of an airplane you can think of, because, you know, the Brits, the Americans, the Germans, the French, the Italians, everybody had airplanes there, and they were all a little bit different. So it was really a unique experience, because up until that time, you know, you always fight against your own type. Right. And so it makes it more the pilots, the difference between pilots, but once you got in that environment, all of a sudden for the first time, you're seeing the difference between airplanes. And that was a really interesting experience. And we would end up in big cyclonic circles of airplanes with 5 or 6 different types, you know, in a thing, and you'd be pulling up on a F-84F or something like that, and behind you would be a Mystère trying to pull up on you. And, I mean, so it was, and another plane would come right between you and the guy you were tracking. I mean, it was an amazing environment.
Yeah, well, so how did you actually get into the astronaut program?
Well, I was doing graduate work at MIT. It was after I got back from the deployment. Of course, that was my second active duty. When Kennedy activated our guard unit, I went back on active duty for a year. So that was my second time in the Air Force and got back out and was finishing up my graduate work at MIT in a place called and I was working in a place called the Experimental Astronomy Laboratory.
Oh.
And so a couple of us there were very interested in the potential, the possibility of becoming an astronaut. And we'd been watching, you know, what the requirements were. And up until that time, one of the prerequisites was to be experimental test pilot or test pilot. Right. And so I knew I had all the other requirements that, you know, that they would come up with, but thinking about how could I work in getting to be an experimental test pilot or a test pilot was really the question. And so we were keeping an eye on things, and then the prerequisite, they said they were going to make a selection, a third group of astronauts. But they decided to put a little more emphasis on the education, provided you had 1,000 hours of high-performance jet time. And so all of a sudden, all of a sudden I qualified.
I'm going to get you closer to the microphone so it'll pick you up better than them.
Yeah.
So what they were doing is they were apparently switching away from test pilots and fighter pilots to scientific people.
Well,
with
they wanted to get a
aviation.
little more of an emphasis on the education, and they, by that time, you know, people realized you didn't have to be a test pilot in order to survive spaceflight.
Sorry, I'm pretty sorry.
It's all right.
Give me just maximum 5 minutes, we'll be done.
Maximum 5 minutes. Well, why don't we just stop for a few minutes?
Yeah.
Just wait.
Oh,
I'll just turn this thing off.
Well, if you're talking about this, sure. I mean, my work with asteroids is you know, what I've spent my life on for the last 12 years. So, I mean, that's what I'm interested in.
Well, let's just go chronologically here. Let's just
Yeah,
it's kind
sure.
of quiet right now. Okay, Apollo 9. Apollo 9 was a big deal
Yeah.
because that's the first time that you can take it from there. What was such a big deal about Apollo 9?
Well, the biggest deal about Apollo 9 was it was the first flight of the Lunar Module. You know, we had flown in space before, so the command module, while it had more capability than Mercury or Gemini, you know, it was a space vehicle and it had been done before. But the idea of a lunar module that could actually land on another body, another planet, and one without any atmosphere, in order to meet the Kennedy goal of, you know, sending someone to the moon and getting them back alive by the end of the decade, that was a pretty big deal.
Were you involved in the design at all?
Oh yeah, yeah. The early, the thing about the astronauts, which was never true of the cosmonauts, the Russian guys, and really has not been true so much since the early Apollo days, is that we're very much involved in the design of the spacecraft. Not so much the basic fundamental designs as the human interface with the control systems and all of the various systems involved.
Well, let's go back a second. One thing that I've always been interested in. Well, the other thing I'm interested in is why is everybody a pilot, right? You got a command pilot, you got a lunar module pilot, everybody's a pilot, but it's kind of curious as to me. I guess everybody wants to be called a pilot for some reason or other.
Well, that was not just you know, a prestige thing or something, but in those days, while everybody had a little bit of specialization with what they did, the fact of the matter is everybody had to be able to fly the vehicle.
Of course.
If somebody got hurt or something happened, you know, you could end up having to bring it back yourself under certain circumstances. So everybody literally did have to be able to fly the spacecraft.
And when I've interviewed other guys, other pilots, so let's just go through the checklist. So take me to the takeoff of this with the Saturn V booster. You're strapped in, and now you're in the left seat. So when you actually take off, though, is it completely automatic?
Well, pretty much the liftoff was and the launch was automatic, and in the sense that the guidance and control, everything was really primarily out of the launch vehicle itself. Its guidance, everything else in getting you into orbit, the launch vehicle was the primary controlling element. It had the guidance, its own guidance system, its own everything. But at the same time, if something went wrong with it, we also had a total redundant capability to fly the launch vehicle from the spacecraft. So even though the primary control was the launch vehicle, and in a sense on Apollo 12, when, you know, Pete Conrad and Al Bean and Dick Gordon, while they were, you know, during the launch, they got hit by a lightning bolt,
Right.
and everything went to hell. And I mean, things went so bad in the spacecraft that, I mean, every warning light and alarm was going off. I mean, they literally broke down laughing because it was such a ridiculous emergency
Right.
kind of thing. And yet they're still going up because nothing happened to the launch vehicle. So the launch vehicle just kept right on going, and all the way through the launch, they're basically getting the spacecraft and the command module back online. You know, it was like a Control-Alt-Delete. and they basically are getting the thing.
Well, that's what they did.
back.
They just shut everything off, didn't they? And then turned it back on.
Well, I'm not sure if they shut everything off with it, but they basically did a complete reset. And of course, all during that time, the launch vehicle was just merely putting them up in the orbit they were supposed to be in. So,
Well, what would be controlling? Because the center engine doesn't rotate, it doesn't move, but the others gimbal around. So was it still steering itself, or did it?
oh yeah, no, it was doing everything was totally normal.
Oh wow.
I mean, the thing that was wrong was all the controls and displays in the spacecraft. But until you get into orbit, those aren't in the game. You know,
Right.
you're all, so your question of was it all automatic? I mean, we never looked at it that way, but the answer is yeah, it was. And on Apollo 12,
Good thing.
good thing. That's right, because while they're doing this unbelievable reset of everything inside the command module,
Well, that must have
launch
been-
vehicle was taking them up.
Because you're pulling 5 and 6 Gs on acceleration.
Well, not in the beginning. I mean, you take off just barely over 1 G. You can.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, you're barely getting off the ground. I mean, it looks like it's taken off very slowly, and
Right.
it is. I mean, I think the actual liftoff, you're going from 1 G, laying on your back,
Sure.
to, I don't know, 1.1 or something like that. I mean, you could hardly feel
Right.
the actual liftoff per se. And then gradually it would, that's not like the shuttle. The shuttle, you kind of jump off the ground. I don't know what the acceleration is, but you're going,
Joe
you
Engel said
jump up to about
Joe
1.3.
Engel said it's about 3.
Well, it's 3 after a while, but I mean, I think you'd probably initially jump up to maybe 1.5 or something like that, right at excess thrust. But the Saturn V barely had more thrust and weight, and
Yeah, I think it was 7,100,000. Something.
yeah,
like that.
and you weighed 6
But
million
then-
something.
But then it had to burn off enough fuel to actually get airborne.
Yeah, I mean, so as I say, when you lifted off in the Saturn V, you were barely more than 1 G.
But by the
But by the time you burned out, now you're much more than the maximum G load in the space shuttle. You never get to more than 3 or 4 Gs at most.
But then when
Sure.
when it's at maximum acceleration, just before the separation,
Right.
I mean, there's a tremendous decel, and then a 2-second before the
Right.
next blast hits.
And
again.
that was a big surprise, actually.
Surprise.
Yeah. You have to recognize that when you're in the suit and you got 3 guys laying side by side in that command module, you're too wide to literally lay there with your arms alongside you. So you'd have to overlap. One guy's arm
Oh, really?
would have to be underneath, the other guy on top, of that kind, and you'd alternate. But it's like sitting next to some overweight people on an airliner, right? You can't. You keep sort of fighting for elbow room on the seat. It's a little bit crowded there, and if something goes wrong on the launch pad, to get out alive before liftoff, you've got to open up the hatch. You've got to unstrap a lot of things. You got to do a whole bunch of really quick things and get your tail out of there. And so after they put us in and strapped down, tighten the shoulder straps and all of that, and close the hatch, we kind of look and make sure they weren't looking at us anymore, and then we'd loosen our shoulder straps.
really?
Yeah, Dave and I wanted to be able to, make sure we could move around. So we kind of loosened our shoulder straps a bit. So as you said, when you're reaching maximum acceleration just before the staging, and all of a sudden you're going from 6 Gs or something like that, and you think about it, that's a long can. I mean, it's an aluminum can that now is empty basically, and it's under 5 Gs of compression.
Mm-hmm.
And when the engine suddenly shut off, that foot or whatever the hell the thing is, shorter, it suddenly springs out to its full length. I mean, that cutoff was very sharp, and so all of a sudden you're on the far end of this thing, and it jumps out to whatever the heck the full length of it is, and then it stops, and Dave and I went flying forward, and our face mask stopped about, it was like
Yeah.
right up to the instrument panel and almost crashed into the instrument panel. And then we, thrown back in our seats, and the two of us kind of looked at each other and went, whoa, that was close.
Well, I heard Bill Anders say that his hand flew up,
Yeah.
and so when it lit again, he broke his face shield.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, and I think he said the same thing happened to Borman. They all were right together. They go like this, and
Well, they didn't tell us about it. And the result was that Dave and I loosened it. And after that, we told the guy, hey, look, don't loosen those shoulder straps because you're going to be going right up against the instrument panel. So
they made actually a big deal out of it in the movie Apollo 13. I just watched it again just to see it because you could really see it go slam forward. All right, let's just skip it all the way ahead to landing. Now you're orbiting the Earth. You're doing 17,005, 4, something like that. The Apollo is somewhat controllable. You can actually steer it around to some extent. And is that all automatic as well?
Well, it depends. Generally speaking, there are degrees of automation in almost everything you're going to do in a spacecraft. You can fly it all the way from completely manually, where every motion you make on,
Go ahead.
where every motion you make on the stick results in a small rocket firing and a change in your acceleration and your attitude. Or you can go from there to telling the computer what you want to do and telling it to go, and then it will fly it all the way around. Now, you're still telling the computer what to do in a case like that. But again, there are 5 or 6 control modes all the way between full manual and fully automatic.
Was that something the astronauts wanted?
Yeah, because different times during the mission for different phases, you can imagine that full manual takes almost all of the electronics and sophistication out of the loop. So it's very reliable, but it's also difficult to control. When you're literally, every motion you make fires a small rocket engine, the speed with which you do it, everything else. So you're kind of, you may get to where you want to go, but you're not doing it efficiently, but you may be doing it very reliably.
Not to mention the fact you're going backwards when you're doing it.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. You're in an airplane, every time you're in an airplane, you're going that way.
Yeah.
You look your head, but you're going that way. In a spacecraft, you can be going any direction. You may be looking that way, but you can be going. And airplanes only go, the long, narrow way.
Right.
That's the way they go. Spacecraft, they don't care.
When you come back after, it was like you spent 10 days in orbit, as I recall.
Yeah.
So now when you decide you're going to come down,
Yeah.
or when it's planned to come down, you fire the retro rocket of some sort, and that was on the command module, or where was that rocket that you fired?
No, in Apollo, you had a big cylindrical section behind the cone,
Right.
and that cylindrical section was called the service module.
Right.
At the back end of the service module was a big service propulsion system, or the big engine. And when you want to, the way you come home is you slow down enough so that on the other side of the Earth, your orbit is closer to the Earth. If you slow down here, I don't know what you can see on your thing there, but if you slow down up here, you're going to come. Your distance from the Earth gets shorter over here.
Mm-hmm.
So to get what you do is the atmosphere is down there below you, and you slow down enough so that as you come on this side of the Earth, you're hitting the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is slowing you down. So what you do is up here, you turn around backward, you fire the SPS engine for a couple of seconds until it slows you down by, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 miles an hour, and then on the other side of the Earth, you're hitting the atmosphere.
So
that's,
you don't
that's
have-
what's bringing you in.
I was surprised with the shuttle. It didn't slow down that much. 140 knots, I think. That's all he said it would slow it down to start coming in.
Yeah, it's not much. I don't remember the ratios anymore, but it's only a few 100 miles an hour, a little less.
Yeah.
That you have to change velocity to make a big change in the orbit.
So now when you start coming back in now, then the G's start building up again.
Yeah,
And then, but looking at the profile, it looks like you're coming down at a certain angle, and then it kind of levels off at some point. The rate of descent isn't as high. I saw it was 0.6½ G's at some point, and then it seems to kind of build the G's lessen. Is that because of the maximum dynamic pressure at a certain point?
yeah. I mean, I frankly don't remember what the G, what the time history of the G forces during entry is. But let me just put it this way: when you start hitting the atmosphere,
Right.
The first thing that happens, even before you feel anything slowing down, you're going really fast. I mean, you're really going a bat out of hell. And what happens is you're going so fast that that early tenuous atmosphere that hits your heat shield is ionizing. I mean, you're literally breaking apart the air
Sure.
molecules because of the tremendous speed that you've
Right.
got. And they ionize, and as they're going around you, they're glowing hot. And so the first thing that happens is the heating pulse. And the heating pulse occurs and peaks and starts back down again before the G, the maximum deceleration,
Oh, is that
comes
right?
in. Yeah, so you have two different pulses. One is the heating, and the second one is the physical slowing down, the deceleration. And it's not completely over by the time, the heating pulse is not completely over by the time you're feeling the deceleration, but it's pretty much there. So the first thing you're seeing, looking backward, because you're going back, your heat shield's behind
Sure.
you, that's going first. You're looking out the window and you're seeing your heat shield
Yeah.
swirling around behind you, all brightly lit like the inside of a neon tube.
Wow.
Okay, and then you start feeling the G's build up.
Can you feel the heat?
No,
Can't feel the heat.
no.
So after the service module engine fires, then you have to get rid of the service module itself.
Oh yeah, way up there, right after you did it.
Get rid of it, and it goes
Yeah,
down.
you slow down so you know you're going to hit the atmosphere. You've got everything done.
Do they know
and
where
then
it's going to
you check.
land? Do they have a pretty good idea where the service module is going to land?
Oh, I'm sure they did, but nobody cared. I mean, it basically breaks up and burns
Yeah,
up during the entry. So
Clever enough, yeah.
yeah, I don't know that there was anything that survived in the service module from the entry. It may have essentially totally burned up. I don't
Yeah.
know.
So anyway, now and then the next thing is the parachutes come out at 25, 30,000 feet, and
Yeah.
what did it feel like to get back down to Earth again?
Well, it feels great, but I mean, the thing that's going on in your head is that all through your mission. That's nice. We got a printer going, but all through your mission, from the time you launch until you're literally on the water, there are these pyrotechnic things that are happening. You push a button and an explosive bolt blows off, and the panels that shield that protect the lunar module and liftoff go flying off. Or I mean, everything that happens, you separate, you turn around, you pick it up. So all through your mission, there are these events, many of which are initiated by some explosive device, an explosive bolt or something that rips the aluminum. There's something going on like that. And you know that as you're coming down, the same thing is going to happen. You blow off the nose cone, and out come the drogue chutes. And the drogue chutes do their job, and then another explosive thing cuts them, and they fly off, and now the main chutes have to be jettisoned out. And the main chutes do their work, but in the end, but you're very aware as you're coming down that there are there's like 3 or 4 explosive things that have got to happen for you to get home alive. Then there are 3, then there are 2, and it's like one more. There's only one more explosion that's got to happen, and then you're on the water. So, but then the last thing, I mean, and I know you've heard this from other people, I mean, the last thing, and the thing where the competitive juices come back into the game, when you hit the water, I mean, you don't want to jettison the main chutes before you hit the water, right? You want
Sure.
the chutes to take you all the way down. But if you leave them on for even a second after you hit the water, the wind, and if there's
Sure.
any wind, it's going to pull you over, and you end up nose down and hanging from your straps instead of right side up. When I say right side up, that means laying there on your back.
Sure, yeah.
Right? The way you see it in the museum.
Right.
So to make sure that you don't get pulled over in what we call stable 2, okay, stable 1 is laying on your back the way you want to. Stable 2, you're hanging upside down.
Oh boy.
And everybody wanted to avoid stable 2, but that means you got to get rid of the chutes so that it doesn't turn you upside
Sure.
down, right? So the trick is to get rid of the chutes right away, but not too early, because you want to make sure you're on the ground. So there's a switch, and that Dave Scott next to me had to throw that switch to jettison the parachutes, but you don't want to run a risk. So you have a double thing. I had the circuit breaker, which powered the switch over next to me. So the sequence is hit the water, circuit breaker, and throw the switch, and the parachutes fly away. And the big question is, can you get it done in time not to go over? And we did.
So, from aviation, was there an engine shutdown checklist when you finally got on the ground, or?
Well, yeah, you have you have a checklist to power everything down, and in a controlled way. Yeah.
How long did it take for the Navy to get there?
We saw them before we landed. I mean,
Oh, really?
you could see them out the window, because coming down in the parachute, you would be gently turning. I mean,
Right.
not a very high rate, and they were in helicopters,
Right.
with the frogmen, and so we actually saw a helicopter, go by the window, out the windows before we touched down. So they were there and ready.
So, now on board you had 3 different people,
Yeah,
and their titles were?
commander, lunar module pilot, and command module pilot.
And so, did the commander actually do any flying?
Oh yeah. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, the person flying either the lunar module or the command module was the commander.
It's weird. Okay, so, all right, so.
Chief pilot.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess that's right. That's what I meant, that they just always attach the name.
I mean, but Dave, there were certain things in the command module where Dave was the one who did all the training on them, and he flew them in spite of the fact that Jim was the commander. In the lunar module, I would test certain things, and again, in the lunar module, the the controls were identical both sides. They're completely redundant. So both the translation control and the rotation control, which are left and right hand, were replicated on both sides. So as a lunar module pilot, I would be checking out certain things and whatnot. But when it came to actual flying, Jim did most of the flying, and I'm reading the instruments and making the different measurements and that kind of thing.
So when you, what do you call it, a simulator, that thing that flew around, I can't think of the name of it, that
Oh, well,
they made 5 of them and 3 of them crashed or something like that.
yeah, I mean, a lunar landing training video, the LLTV and things like that, but they were for the people who were going to land on the moon, and our mission, we're going to fly it in Earth orbit. So the actual lunar touchdown kind of thing, we didn't do that training.
Right.
That was the one part of Apollo 9 that we couldn't really do we couldn't check that out.
Right.
That was not something that we did.
So now okay, so you're up there, and I mean, I know where I'll have to show this on a diagram to show where the LEM actually was in the
S4B, you mean
right, whatever that was.
at liftoff?
Yeah, but then when you actually got up into space, then you actually had to separate, and then you
Yeah.
had to get it up.
You had to separate, turn around, and dock with the top of the lunar module.
Well, was it empty then, or did you get into it to do that?
No, it was empty, and the lunar module, and so first of all, we would separate from
Right.
it, and then the
doors.
spacecraft LEM adapter, the SLA panels, four
Right.
panels, would fly off and expose the lunar module,
Right.
and we turned around and docked with it.
Oh, so you turned around. Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and then again, there's the firing of the explosive bolts. You know,
Sure.
then we fire the signal to let go, to separate the lunar module from the S4B, and then we pull it away from the the third stage of the
Right.
Saturn V. Right?
Was that about the first or second orbit? That was pretty early.
Oh yeah, it was right away. Yeah, right after you got into orbit.
Wasn't it sort of a spring-activated thing that actually pushed it out there somewhere after the bolts were blown off?
There may have been some spring forces there. I don't remember.
'Cause you didn't-
But we pulled it out.
Okay.
We just fired the rockets to go backward.
And so then when was it? So now since you, the lunar module pilot, you were the first one to come out.
Yeah, but that wasn't until the third day of the mission.
Oh, okay.
We had 2.5 days of work docked from inside the command module that we did before we ever activated the lunar module. I mean, the lunar module was powered by batteries. So once you activated the batteries, you had to get the work done. I mean, everything, after you activated those lunar module batteries, it was total focus on the lunar module, getting everything tested, because, you know, after 3 days of work or so, the batteries were dead and all drained, and that's the end. It kicked it off the nose.
But they did actually, on Apollo 13, they recharged the batteries using the service module at one point towards the end of the mission.
But that was not the design.
No, heck no.
Yeah, but so I mean, the lunar module batteries were limited length, enough to get whatever the mission was. I mean, later on the moon, I guess maybe as much as 4.5 days or something like that of battery power. But that was it. There were no fuel cells, there were no solar cells, so you're operating purely on battery power and just going down to the end of the mission.
So what did you do in the intervening 3 days? Practice moving the...
Well, it was a matter of, I mean, we'd never maneuvered two vehicles before. You know, it was a matter of testing. It was the tunnel is, you know, a little wider than your shoulders. Sure. And here are these two vehicles on the end of that relatively narrow tunnel, you know, sort of an hourglass kind of thing, like the neck of an hourglass. And so one of the big questions was what happens when that big engine on the back of the service module is lit and starts swiveling around.
Oh boy.
So one of the things that we did on the second day up there was we not only lit it off to make sure to test the stresses and the fact that you could control it, but we actually gave it a sawtooth thing so that we would purposely set up the harmonics in the interface to make sure that the strength of the tunnel was what it was engineered to be. And you want to think about three guys thinking they better have got this right. You bet.
Well, you could probably, because you're looking at the LEM right in front of you.
Yeah.
So you could probably see the...
Probably. I don't remember. but we didn't like. It wasn't like, you know, today you can look out on an aircraft wing and you can see in turbulence the wing flapping around. Well, it wasn't that bad, but you know, if the tunnel didn't hold, I mean, you had some pretty serious problems.
How long did it take to heat the service module after you got established in space? Does it take quite a while to warm the thing up?
To warm up the service module?
Yeah, I mean, you had to warm it up, didn't you, after you got...
Not really. I don't think so. I don't.
Really?
Now, on the way to the moon, the guys would do a barbecue maneuver.
Yeah, right.
But that wasn't to heat it up. That was to keep the temperatures relatively uniform
Right.
on it. But of course, on Apollo 9, we're flying around the Earth, so the Earth is pretty warm itself, and just naturally moving around, you're keeping pretty uniform
Yeah.
temperatures. So we didn't get big temperature differentials. But when you were going to the moon, now you're out, a long way from the Earth, a long way from the moon, and so the sunlight's on one side, and if you're not rotating purposely, you're going to get real hot on one side and real cold on the other. So that was the reason they did the barbecue maneuver on the way to the moon.
Let's see, what was that? I was going to ask. You guys did go out 1,000 miles or so, didn't you?
No. I don't think we went. I'd have to look. I mean, you know more about my mission than I do, to be honest with you. I mean,
You can read the book.
Yeah, I can read the book, right? I got better things to read. But,
maybe it was 10 that went out to 3,000 or 4,000 miles. They went out pretty far.
well, they went all the way to the moon. I don't think so. I think we went probably to 300 miles, something like that. We didn't get very high.
Yeah.
I mean, I think maybe from the low point of our orbit to the high point at one point might have been, 150 to 300 or something like that. I don't honestly remember. And the next flight went, every flight after Apollo 9 went all the way to the moon. So, we didn't, that wasn't, again, there was no reason for us to test that. Now, Apollo 8 before us also went to the moon, but that was without the Lunar Module. So.
Right.
But we're the only time, anytime you see an Apollo picture where you got the Earth out there, that's us.
Yeah.
Because we're the only ones that flew, Apollo 7, the command module.
Right.
Wally Shaw's flight there. They were around here, but the only one with the Lunar Module near the Earth, that's us.
So let's talk about actually controlling the lunar module. You took it out, so there was basically two guys together.
Yeah.
Take the thing and you separated, you got 100 miles ahead or so.
Yeah.
So now the command module is going to rejoin. And it actually does the rejoin on the LEM rather than the other way around, correct?
Well, you could do it either way. Either the command module could be passive and the lunar module be the active element in the docking, or you could have the lunar module be passive and the command module do the docking. It worked either way, but it was much more difficult from the lunar module because, we were standing in the lunar module and we're looking that way, which is, if you think about the lunar module, we're looking out those triangular front windows.
Right.
Okay, well, the tunnel is behind you and up there, the axis going this way, not that way.
Right.
So when you dock, you have to be going that way, not this way. Well, to do that, you have to look up. And there was a window, a small rectangular window over McDivitt's head as a commander. So when he was docking, the lunar module was the active element, docking with the command module, McDivitt's having to look 90 degrees above his head and still fly down here.
That's why it was so hard.
Yeah, and it's maddening because, when you're looking out here and you roll, you put in a roll command, things roll. But you're up there and you want to roll and you want to go that way, well, that's actually a yaw. Right. And so everything is cross-coupled, it's screwy, and it was very difficult for the lunar module to be the active element in the docking. But we needed to prove that would work, and so again, that's an example of the kind of thing we did on Apollo 9, not because we ever did it again after that. It was much easier for the command module to dock, but we did it to prove and demonstrate that the lunar module could do it if something was wrong with the command module.
So now what are the actual dynamics to rejoin? The LEM was out in front, and then the command module's in back. And you can see them on, I guess they're on radar, they use radar to rejoin. But how do you do it? Like I said before, it's not just adding the gas and moving up like you would.
Well, you're talking about the rendezvous.
The rendezvous, right.
Oh, well, okay, that's well, I'm going to have to give you an audio orbital dynamics 101,
Okay.
I mean, you're certainly aware, and I'm sure everybody who watches this film is probably at least loosely aware that if you're in a lower orbit, you're going to go around the Earth faster. If you're in a higher orbit, you go around slower. So if you're going around the Earth and you're behind the command module and you need to catch up with it, you need to be in a lower orbit. Okay, you can't be in the same orbit and go faster. There's no such thing. When you're in any orbit, you're going at a fixed speed. If you go faster, you're going to end up going up. Mm-hmm. So to catch up with something that's ahead of you, you need to be in a lower orbit, which means you're going to go around the Earth a little bit faster, and therefore you're gradually catching up with it. Now, what you do is you come to a certain point where now you're behind it, but you're catching up. Now what you want to do is come around, relatively speaking, you're going to come around like this and dock. Okay? You don't come in like this, you don't come in behind. You come up from below and you make a U-turn. You're doing a half of a loop, basically.
An Immelman in space.
I'm sorry?
I say an Immelman in space.
Yeah, it's an Immelman, exactly. Except you don't have to roll when you get to the top. But you're doing a half of a loop, and that's called terminal phase initiate, TPI, and you'll hear in the various audio things on Rendezvous and you'll hear TPI, at least in the Apollo days. That's what we call it. And then you're doing mid-course corrections, and the radar is working and giving you the information. Are you in the right place or the right distance?
So is this manual or is this an automatic function as well?
Well, again, you're basically telling the computer what you want it to do, and then you're watching it and keeping track of it to make sure that it does it, and you're measuring angles out the window to make sure that the computer isn't screwed up, but you're cross-checking it all the time. And you can always take over if you decide the computer is somehow screwed up. You can take over, and then you can put in the manual commands.
So on board the LEM, you couldn't see them until they were fairly close coming up underneath you then?
Well, we were the active part. I mean, the Lunar Module, we were the ones doing the rendezvous.
Okay.
When you're coming off the moon, you're catching up with, and you're the one who's the active member. And so on Apollo 9, that's the same thing we did after we were 100 miles away.
So looking out of the little window above you then?
No, you're looking at the front window. There's no reason to make it comfortable.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there's no aerodynamics, so you don't have to have the tunnel headed until you're ready to dock. Right. So I mean, we're looking out the front window, but you don't see it until you're 30 miles away or something, and the sun's shining on it. You see a point out there.
So how long does the procedure take from 100 miles back or so?
Oh, I don't know. I think it was probably a couple of hours, two hours or so.
So it's going to get dark at some point.
Yeah. You go through night and day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I mean the other thing which is important in all of this is the timing. Number one, when you're training for all of this, once you have the basic things that you have to do, the basic maneuvers and thrusting maneuvers and mid-course, all this stuff done. Once you have that basically down, from that point on, for the next 6 months before your mission, the guys out on the control panel in the simulator are making things go wrong. Always. You're always dealing with 1, 2, 3, 4 failures, of different things that the trainers are screwing up with you, to make you figure out how you can get back alive without this, that, or the other thing, or the interaction between them. So, I mean, you're always scrambling. That's the whole point of training. Now in the real world, things aren't going wrong. This engine isn't failing, or that control system, or that valve, or that pressure is normal. So in the real mission, McDivitt and I are flying along during the rendezvous, and it's like, why do we have all this time? We're not going around like one-armed paper hangers trying to get everything done. And it's because everything's working, right? Now, the other thing is that if you think about the moon and the Earth, as it were, the geometry is the same in terms of, when you start the maneuver and all that kind of stuff. But a lunar orbit takes 2 hours to go around, and Earth orbit takes an hour and a half. So everything in Earth orbit happens faster than it does in lunar orbit.
Why is it? It seems like it would be.
Because the gravity is lower at the moon. Okay, so a lunar orbit is basically 2 hours.
And you're doing.
The Earth orbit's 90 minutes for low orbit.
You're doing 3,500 or something or other on the moon. It's not that fast.
I don't know.
It wasn't that fast. I was going to surprise.
We don't think about speed. Think about time. Everything is so many minutes a second. I mean, that's what counts. Speed is something you write about in a newspaper or whatever. 17,000 miles an hour. Big deal. What's that mean? Relative speed is important.
Sure.
You want to be going, 1 foot per second when a fraction of a mile an hour when you dock, things like that. But the absolute speed around the planet. I mean, what is a person on? You can go out on the street there and ask somebody how fast you're going around the sun. They don't have a clue. We're going 67,000 miles an hour around the sun. Does anybody know it? No. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, right. Yeah. So speed, speed doesn't mean anything. But how long it takes you to get around means something, because that's the curved space you're going through.
Right.
And in the moon, it takes you longer. It takes you 2 hours. So to go through the same arc, it's slower on the moon by 25% or 33% slower. So the guys coming up to rendezvous and dock off the lunar surface had it even easier. Not only were the systems working and things not going wrong, but also the basic orbital mechanics is different, so that they have more time. So it was, it was comfortable.
No.
We weren't going crazy trying to get everything done. and that was a nice thing to see.
So anyway, now next is this great picture.
Yeah, right.
And I've seen you talk about this before, but your 5 or 10 minutes to think about things.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, first, I guess you'll show it, so I don't have to show it here. But the picture.
No, hold on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this picture is one that I took from the Lunar Module down here of Dave Scott. I mean, that's not a picture of me. That's a picture I took of Dave. And Dave, of course, couldn't come out of the hatch because he had an umbilical. He was connected to the environmental system in the command. He doesn't have a backpack on. It had all the independence. I had the portable life support system on.
How long had you been out there before he started to come out?
Oh, probably 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know, something like that. And I'm on the front porch, taking pictures of Dave, and Dave's taking pictures of me, and all that. And he was doing some work, and I was documenting what he was doing, etc. But yeah, the point you're talking about is that the primary reason for going outside, doing the EVA on Apollo 9, was to test the portable life support system that I had on my back, providing all the communications, life support, the suit, and not the suit, but the suit and the backpack combined, that the guys ran around with on the moon afterward. And everybody's seen the pictures of people running around on the moon. Well, I was the first one that tested that outside. That was really why we did the EVA on Apollo 9.
Had you tested it? You obviously tested it on the ground before.
Yeah, but I mean, testing it on the ground, you're not in weightlessness, so things are very different.
Right. Did you get in the pool in those days?
Oh yeah, I went under. Oh yeah, a lot of training was done underwater.
Yeah, okay.
Neutral buoyancy. But again, being underwater, you're suspended in the water. But if you're suspended upside down, you're crunched into the top of the suit. I mean, you're not weightless. Yeah. It's not sinking because it's neutrally buoyant, but you're standing on your head and the blood is rushing to your head, and and you're in one side of the suit and the arm side, instead of being here, You know, it's out here, so you're, you know, I mean, it's painful. You come out of a training session from underwater with blood running down your shoulders.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
Wow.
it was not unusual at all.
Oh, wow.
I mean, black and blue. I mean, training for EVA was a challenge, and you know, there's a lot of work involved and a lot of pain. But in space, totally different. You're floating inside the suit. You don't even feel it when
Right.
you're not moving around. It's very, very comfortable. And so I'm outside, and aside from the suit and the portable life support system working properly, which was the main part of the test, the other thing was the next day we were going to be going out, separating and doing the rendezvous and docking that we were just talking about. Well, there was always a possibility that when you came back together, something would go wrong. The probe and drogue wouldn't work, and we couldn't get them out of the tunnel, or something like that. And if you couldn't get the probe and drogue out of the tunnel, then you couldn't get through it to get back to the command module. Mm-hmm. So one of the other objectives we had was to demonstrate on the EVA the day before, on the third day I guess it was the fourth day of the mission, to demonstrate that I could transfer externally from the lunar module up the handrail, across the top of the lunar module, and over to the command module, and ultimately get in by going outside. The objective was to cross up the front and to get from one vehicle to the other externally, and to demonstrate we could do that. And Dave was taking a movie of me doing that for documentary purposes, not for public relations, but to make sure that I wasn't flopping around, or how well I could control myself on the handrails and that kind of thing. So Dave was, as you see in the picture there, had the movie camera set up to document me making this traverse. And I got 3 feet up the handrail on the front of the lunar module, just basically going up the handrail, when Dave said, "Oh, the camera failed, camera jammed. Jim, give me a minute to see if I can get the camera working again." And so McDivitt said, "Okay, Dave, I give you 5 minutes to try to get the camera unjammed. Rusty, stay there. Stay right there, Rusty." "Yes, sir." Man, that was great. So while Dave was trying to get the camera fixed and working again, which never happened, I was just hanging on the front of the lunar module with nothing to do for that 5 minutes. And so I said to myself, hey, this is my time to really take a time out, and just I let go with my right hand and just sort of swung around, and the command module's up there, the sun's over here. I'm looking at the Earth and the horizon. I mean, it was my time to be a human being in space, and that's what I did for 5 minutes. And that was a very impressive time, because it was, up until that time you're just busy. You're following the checklist. You're talking to the ground. You're doing all this stuff, and all of a sudden, for 5 minutes, total silence. Dave is working, trying to fix the camera. I don't know what the hell McDivitt was doing inside, but thankfully he wasn't making a bunch of noise. And I'm not talking, so it's totally silent. The radio only comes on when there's a noise. It's a voice-operated system. So when nobody's talking, the radio's off. There's no noise at all. All the pumps and fans and things in the backpack, completely quiet. You don't hear them at all. They're very, very quiet. And so you're just floating there inside the suit with no restriction to visibility, because the helmet was just a bubble. And it's like you're floating naked in space, just looking at this unbelievable, beautiful scene. And that was, so right away, it didn't take 5 seconds when all of a sudden, you're really in a different environment there. You're no longer, an astronaut being busy. You're a human being in a completely different environment. And that's what I let come in. At that point, what I understood my job to be was I was a representative of humanity, absorbing this experience.
So you've had 45 years as of what, last Saturday or something or other to think about that experience.
Yeah. 46.
46?
Yeah. 69 to 15.
Oh, yeah. And you landed on the 13th, I think?
Yeah, on the 13th.
Yeah. Coming away from that, I mean, does that give you a greater feeling for humanity, or?
Well, I mean, it's a total...
Poor question, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a totally different perspective because, I mean, the thoughts that went through my mind, I mean, it isn't so much now. For 46 years is not it. The time when I really thought about, I mean, the experience that made a big difference conceptually, intellectually, for me was that 5 minutes when I really let everything come in. But it wasn't, it was through the next 4 or 5 years until 1972, I think it was. I guess it is. So it was about 72. 3 years basically integrating that experience. And I didn't talk about it that much until 1972 when I gave a talk at a place called Lindisfarne, the Lindisfarne Association. And specifically, Bill Thompson, who was the director of this group that I was speaking to, had asked me to talk about reflecting on humanity looking back at itself from space. And I mean, we worked out, that's what I should talk about. And so in that process of getting ready for that talk, it was when I was really processing what was that experience and the implications of it. And I mean, so that was the first time that I really talked about it, and that's written up in different places. But basically, humanity, the marriage of human beings and our machines are enabling us to operate within environments of all different kinds, whether that's underwater or, running around in our cars at 80 miles an hour, whatever. Humankind and our machines that we're married to are enabling, in this case, human life, consciousness to move out from the Earth into space for the first time. This is a one-time event, consciousness beginning to move out into the universe from this particular focus of life here on planet Earth. There may be others, who knows? But that's what's going on, and historically, I realized that was what I was a part of. And that's a sense of responsibility. The responsibility to bring that experience and that realization to the rest of consciousness, human life, and life for that matter, not just human. So to me, it was that big picture which the information which allowed that big picture occurred during those 5 minutes, when the camera failed. And I think if I had been busy, I would never have, it would have been a totally different experience. And then it was, 3 years of sort of letting it cook and ferment before I really ever thought about it in the sense of articulating it to a group of intelligent people, thoughtful people, who I could share it with. I mean, and that was a very, very interesting experience. I mean, at the end of this talk, which went for about 45 minutes, I mean, there were probably 50 people in the audience. It was a relatively small group, there were probably 50 people, and 45 of them were crying. And I was one of them, I mean, I had never really put it into words before. I never really articulated what that experience was and the implications of it. And so that was quite impressive.
Very neat. So how much farther are we going to go in space?
Oh, there's no limit. I mean, the things that limit. You actually, it's almost an inadvertent introduction to the work I'm doing right now. But,
I know.
I mean, there are two basic things which will prevent this evolutionary process that we're involved in here, life on planet Earth, and the evolutionary development of life, to continue ad infinitum. Those two things are, number one, you got to stop asteroids or comets, but comets are very few and far between, but basically you have to prevent asteroid impacts from wiping us out like it did the dinosaurs, like they do the dinosaurs. And they're still going on. I mean, this is an ongoing process. So proactively, we have the capability to predict those impacts and to prevent them. And the question is, will we do that? The second thing you have to do, and you do that first one in order to give yourself, to give humanity, to give evolution enough time that we can begin to disperse off the planet to other environments in space. It's the old story of, you don't want to get everybody together so that one hand grenade can wipe everybody out, right? Well, it's the space equivalent of that. It's only when life begins to distribute, to disperse itself around and diversify its environment that you end up with a kind of assurance that something won't happen that wipes everybody out.
I'm sure you've seen the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still.
The first time ago.
I know, but I mean, I remember I was in about 6th grade.
Yeah.
I was born in 41, so I'm 6-7 years younger than you are.
Yeah.
And when I watched it, I mean, I thought it was great. And then when we watched it again years later,
I haven't watched it. I think I probably haven't watched it since the first time I saw it. So.
Well, the message.
But I remember the guy coming down the stairs.
Right. Well, the astronaut, cosmonaut, he explains when he
Alien.
Yeah, the alien. Well, he explains the reason we're here is because we don't, this is the start of aviation. You're not touching space.
Yeah.
You have atomic weapons. We don't want you sharing those with everybody else. And if
Yeah.
you guys try to expend this aggressiveness to other, we're coming back, and
Yeah.
you won't like it.
You remember that you didn't remember that from the first time. You remember that from the second or third time you saw it.
Second or third time.
Yeah.
Well, I've been trying to get my grandson to watch it.
But I mean, that's a, it's kind of a natural human thing to imagine that part of the responsibility of moving out off the Earth into space is that we're going to take a perfect version of ourselves out there. That's not real. That's not reality. We will go out into space when we can, imperfect though we may be. So we're involved in the process right now. That's what's going on.
So now that we've actually discovered that there's not just millions of planets and millions of solar systems and billions, it just goes on forever. I mean, I'm sure you've given some thought. Is there anything else out there? Anybody else intelligent out there, or?
Well, I mean, you look. I often at the end of a talk, any talk I give, not always, but quite often, if I've gotten at all into the philosophical element of things, I almost always show a picture of the Hubble Deep Field.
Right.
And it's I have a beautiful version of it. I show this picture, and it's just nothing but points of light, and some spiral galaxies you can sort of make out in it. And I point out to people that every point of light that they can see in that is not a star. There's not a star in there, an individual star. Every single point of light is a galaxy. And most of them have 100 billion stars in them or more. So there's thousands of galaxies and hundreds of billions of stars in there, and that's a very small part of the sky. Now you think about that for a minute, and we now know, unlike when I was a kid, or you were a kid, we now know that just about every planet out there, every star out there has planets around it. So it's not just stars and galaxies, but it's also billions and billions of planets. Now to imagine that we're the only planet that has life on it is, to me, is ridiculous, ludicrous.
Arrogant.
Yeah, it's terribly and incredibly arrogant. But there's not a bit of data that says that there is. It's just a probability issue.
Well, what'd you
so,
tell- well, like-
so to me, it's ridiculous to assume anything other than, yes, there's life all through the universe.
Yeah. Just, but then you watch Neil deGrasse Tyson, who you talked to.
Done very well.
Yeah, I know. I listened to that yesterday. It was interesting that when he describes life on Earth, I mean, it seems like so many slight accidents here and there that this bumping into that and this falling off of that, and otherwise we wouldn't be here.
Right.
So
It's absolutely true. But I think the message that one takes from that kind of list of incredible things that had to happen in order for human life to be what it is here, for this to be reality. The real lesson from that is not that life is so rare, although it may be rare, but rare, when you're multiplying rare by billions times billions,
Sure.
is common, right?
yeah,
The real lesson, it seems to me, is that each element, each form of life is probably unique. I mean, there are enough variables in what shapes life that to have life identical one place and another is probably pretty unusual.
Yeah.
So I think the forms of life and the forms life takes and how advanced it is here, there, and the other place, or how primitive, there's probably a tremendous variability in that.
let's talk about B612.
Yeah.
Let me move this a little closer so it can hear you better.
Okay.
I mean, it says, why don't you tell us what that is?
Well, back in 2001, a number of us had been realizing that asteroids were being found, I mean, largely through Gene Shoemaker, the great geologist who in fact wanted to be an Apollo astronaut but couldn't make it because of a heart problem. But nevertheless, Gene Shoemaker demonstrated to everybody that Meteor Crater in Winslow, Arizona was an impact, not some kind of a volcanic thing or whatever. But that was, an asteroid had hit there and made that hole in the ground. And he and his wife, Carolyn, and their friend David Levy started actively looking for asteroids. They figured if they're there in some other places on the Earth, it's probably a common occurrence. And so they started looking for it, and they were finding all kinds of asteroids that were coming across the Earth's orbit, not out between Mars and Jupiter in the main asteroid belt, but there were a lot of these things that we now call near-Earth asteroids whose orbits come in and cross the Earth's orbit. And what we were realizing back in the 90s, well, you have to remember that in fact that team of the two Shoemakers and David Levy found the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet that ended up breaking into 23 pieces or something and hitting Jupiter, and everybody in the world with a telescope saw for the first time that there were active things going on. Things were hitting the planets, and the Earth was no different. And so this whole thing of realizing that, in fact, we're in a shooting gallery, and that asteroids are coming by the Earth all the time and impact it all the time, suddenly began to sink in. And it was clear to a number of us who were watching the rate at which we were discovering these objects with really primitive telescopes that this was probably a pretty big number. And yet nobody at that time, 2001, was doing anything about what do you do when you find one that's got our address on it. And that's just a matter of time. And it happens all the time, frankly, but usually it's small enough objects that the atmosphere protects us. We now know that. 100 tons of material come in every night. Yeah, 100 tons of asteroids and comets, bits and pieces of them, come into the Earth's atmosphere every night.
How much hits the ground?
Very little. But when they get big enough, they break into pieces and you end up with meteorites on the ground. and we find meteorites. And in fact, you probably own a couple, and I own a couple. You know, people have meteorites, they wear them on jewelry, whatnot. So we get hit, and we don't think about it.
Is it granite or what is it? Is it a sort of a common rock that you could find here on Earth otherwise?
Well, meteorites come, and asteroids, of course, where they come from, come in different types, because some of the asteroids are planets that almost make it, but broke apart by Jupiter and other things, I mean, other forces, which essentially disallowed the material between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter to form into a single planet. But big enough pieces got together.
Can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
What the heck is gravity?
What is gravity?
I knew that. I knew that.
Well, I mean, it's a simple thing to state. I mean, gravity is a force between any two objects that have mass.
Why?
It's a principle a fundamental principle of nature.
But no one seems to know exactly why, I suppose. I mean, is there?
Well, but why is existence? I mean, no, that's a kind of question that can't be. Why can't be really addressed. What can be addressed and how it works and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we don't. I mean, there's no scientific answer to why anything fundamental. How, what, you know, how the universe works is what science plays with, not why.
What I was taken by when I was reading about Apollo 13 is how when the thing blew up, all the debris and the oxygen that came out of the oxygen tank, which you probably saw the one we have at the museum yesterday. We have one. It stayed right with the ship. It was like, wow. Why didn't it just blow away? Well, there's no wind, of course. Yeah. But the gravity of the object itself kept everything in it with it.
Well, some things. I mean, there's some things that drifted away at greater than escape velocity,
right,
and they kept going.
Right.
But other things probably there were, once the initial breakup was complete, some things had a low enough velocity moving away that they probably just slowed down due to the very weak gravity of the spacecraft and just stayed there. And that's the same thing with asteroids or anything else. I mean, it's the same thing right here. But when I do that, the gravity of the Earth, I mean, the Earth is big enough that it's going to pull those glasses back down to the surface. So, but when you get to asteroid sizes, now the gravity is very, very weak, but it's there.
And that the camera they landed on that asteroid not too long ago,
Philae on Rosetta.
Right. Is that going to wake up again, you think, when it gets to the right side of the sun?
I'm hoping so. My guess, who knows, but my guess is it will. We'll see. In another couple of months, we should know whether that happens. Because, asteroids, just like the Earth, they generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, they spin around an axis. And the Earth spins around an axis, and you end up with spring, summer, fall, and winter, and things that were in shade near the Earth poles, either North or South Pole, end up in sunlight throughout the year. So that's exactly what's going on. And Philae at the moment is in an area that's permanently shaded, but the lighting is going to change as the year progresses. And
how far away is it?
From us or from the sun?
Is it inside our? I don't even know.
No, the comet. The comet that Rosetta went to, 47P, but don't ask me to name it. But 47P is I think, entirely outside the Earth's orbit. It may actually cross slightly inside the orbit of the Earth, so it may be a near-Earth asteroid, but it's not a main belt asteroid, right, but it is mainly outside the Earth's orbit.
So what is the idea of B612?
Well, B612, I mean, realizing that nobody was doing anything about what do we do when we find one that's in fact heading for an intersection with the Earth's orbit, I mean, heading for a collision, heading for an impact, we got together to say, fundamentally to ask two questions. Number one, even if we know about it, is there anything that can be done? Is there anything humankind can do with our technology, with our space capability, to stop it?
And hopefully Bruce Willis isn't busy that weekend.
Well, Bruce is not the answer to that question. But and the second question, and the answer to that was yes. After a couple of days of working through using nuclear energy, advanced engines, propulsion, various things, looking at it, it was quite obvious that yes, if we had enough early warning, the answer is yes, we can prevent an impact. Find all the asteroids that have the potential, if they hit, of doing damage, doing really serious damage.
But how do you find them?
With telescopes.
What telescopes? Oh, I thought you were going to put something out in space.
No. You search for them the same way you look.
Oh, okay, cool.
You know, that's how we found all the asteroids that we found.
Right.
You know, big ground telescopes looking up, and you see, unlike the stars, which are always in the same place, you see things moving.
Yeah.
Things that are moving are, generally speaking, asteroids or comets. And so that's what you do. You start looking for them, and that's what the Congress told NASA to do in 1998 with what was called the Spacecraft Survey, to find 90% of the ones that, if they hit, could do really serious planetary level damage. And when I say planetary level, I'm saying something that hits in Japan is going to affect us dramatically, not just people in Japan.
We're talking 100 kilotons or something or other.
Oh! No. You're talking hundreds of megatons.
Megatons, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, you're talking, a 1 kilometer diameter object is basically a planetary event if it hits the Earth.
Dinosaur type.
No, it's not extinction level. But you are talking basically, years of low agricultural productivity because of dust in the air. You're talking millions of people killed. You're talking a global economy that's totally devastated. You're probably talking the dark ages in terms of civilization. I mean, an event of that kind, hundreds of millions of megatons of energy released you're changing the world. You're changing you eliminate civilization, basically.
Have they found any of those out there yet?
Oh yeah, there are 1,000 of them.
Ooh.
And we found about 95% of them over the 10 years, 12, 13 years that we've been looking for, that NASA has had that charge. So yeah, there are about, and we know what the demography is. We know that there are about 1,000 of them that size, and we found about 95% of them, and we're tracking them. And none of them have any kind of a substantial chance of hitting the Earth in the next 100 years. But what we don't know, if you look at it, you say, okay, well, how about something less? How about something wipes out a continent, or a local region, or even a city? Okay, now you're coming down in size, but wiping out a city is a damn big event. I mean, we had a couple of skyscrapers wiped out in New York, and aside from the politics of it, there was a pretty big ripple in the global economy from 2 skyscrapers. You wipe out all of New York, it's going to be a lot bigger. So city killers, which are 40 meters in diameter, not kilometer, 40 meters in diameter. This hotel, basically, okay? I mean, this hotel may not even be 40 meters high. Yeah, it's probably about 40 meters high, but it's probably not 40 meters around. But anyway, if this hotel came in at, 29, 30,000 miles an hour, it's going to wipe out all of San Diego.
Do all the asteroids kind of go the same speed? Do they come in the same direction? Or is it
not exactly, but approximately, yes. I mean, so you're talking some variation. But anyway, so B612, so we answered the question, number one, can something be done? Yes. The second question was, can we do something? We scientists, engineers, astronomers that were, gathered 25 of us or something, wrestling with this, can we do something to bring this about? And the answer was, we probably can't do it from inside the government, but we could probably form some kind of a nonprofit group which could take this on and do some of the basic thinking and work that needed to be done to understand deflection and to push NASA to do it, and the Congress and everybody else.
So the point is not.
So
to,
that's how we formed the B612.
so the idea is
Foundation.
not blow things up; it's to deflect it.
Yeah, you don't want to blow things up. You blow things up and you get hit by a shotgun blast rather than a rifle bullet that
Sure.
may or may not be better.
Right.
And you can't guarantee you're not. Whereas with the deflection, you do it in a controlled way, and when you're done, you can guarantee that you're not going to get hit. Not only that, you can guarantee that that object isn't going to come back and hit you for the next 100 or 200 years.
So, is there an engine out there, an ion engine type thing that would actually that you could strap onto your
Deflection technology is relatively, in principle, it's relatively simple. All you got to do, if an asteroid is headed to the Earth, to hit the Earth 20 years from now, you need to be up there and change its velocity by 0.02 of a mile an hour in order to make it miss the Earth. That's all you have to do. You have to change its velocity from 67,000 miles an hour to 67,000.02 miles an hour, or make it 0.02 of a mile an hour less. You make it either less.
and you don't have to land on it. You just have
No,
to
you don't have to land on it. And I mean, the number one thing you do is you run into it. It's a compound thing. It's not a mission. It's a deflection campaign. Okay. The number one thing in that deflection campaign, in terms of changing the velocity, is you just run into it with a spacecraft. And you run into it going like a bat out of hell. It's like rear-ending a car on a freeway, okay? You're going to change its velocity.
Sure.
And that's what you do. Now, that's a very robust, I mean, the words we use, that's a very robust, but a very inaccurate, imprecise, unpredictable result. You want to hit it hard enough that it's good enough that you're going to make it miss the Earth, okay? But you want to put it in a precise orbit. And so then, after you do that rough job, now you pull in with a thing called a gravity tractor or the equivalent, and you tow it a little bit one way or the other to make sure that it's a precise orbit you put it in that's not going to come back and hit you. Okay? And that's a deflection campaign. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. But all you're doing is precisely changing the velocity of an asteroid that's going to hit the Earth 10 years before it's going to hit it. So you have to predict, and you got to get early warning of something happening 20 years in the future.
I guess you could actually make a device that could sort of be on station out there.
Nope.
No. I mean,
Because there's an infinite number of orbits. What station do you put it on?
wherever it was last, just let it sit there with the orbit and.
No. You know, there's a million asteroids out there that we got to worry about. Okay, if I talk about these city killers, while we found 95% of the things that can do planetary level damage, in terms of city killers, we found today less than 1%. So we got 99% to go. There are a million objects of that size that cross the Earth's orbit. So that's the magnitude of the job, but it's a matter of simply doing it. We know how to do it. It doesn't cost much to do it.
Really?
No.
Why?
What the hell does it cost a telescope? A telescope.
Oh, to see it, of course.
Then
Then,
find
yeah.
it. What you need to do is find these things, and then you have their orbits, and you just keep tracking them. You
Is
don't
there-
need to go to them.
Is there anything right now that they could say if they found one right now that they could get up there with an Orion or something like that and put your tracker on there? Is there anything mechanical right now that we have that can suffice to do that sort of thing?
Well, you have telescopes on the ground that find them
No, but I mean-
and predict their orbits and determine their orbits. And we're proposing a space telescope that will do a better job at
Right,
that.
right.
Okay, so finding them is the big thing. Once you find them and get their orbits, you can predict 100 years ahead of time whether or not that asteroid is going to hit the Earth.
But do we have anything right now that would go out and do what you want to do?
Deflection.
Right,
We know what to do.
right.
Okay, we've worked out all the technology of what has to be done. So we know what has to be done. We know that we can do it in terms of having the technology, but it has not been demonstrated. And we have not, in 15 years of pushing the Congress, the President, and NASA ever been able to get them to accept that responsibility for humanity.
Well, they got so many other balls in the air and wars to worry
Right.
about. That.
At the moment, the Europeans are doing the best work on deflection.
Oh, is that right?
Right.
So is there, let's say it was tomorrow was decided that one was going to impact us in 20 years. How fast could they get something up there to deflect it?
Well, if I use exactly the words you said, if we know probability 1.0, okay, that object is going to hit the Earth in 20 years, we can go up and deflect it.
You can do it right now.
Yeah, we'd have to scramble,
Yeah.
okay, but I've got to also convince everybody else that probability is 1, that it's going to hit the Earth in 20 years, and that we can do it. But we can do that. The problem is that our telescopes aren't good enough to give us a probability of 1. So what I'm going to tell you is that the probability of that asteroid hitting the Earth in 2036 on April the 14th at 2 p.m., that probability is 1 in 100. Now what are you going to do? And in another 3 months, I'll be able to tell you that probability has increased to 1 in 50. This is the frog in the water, and then you turn the water on. Okay? And I got to tell you something else. You're going to deflect this thing? Or are the Russians going to deflect it? Or maybe it's the European space program that's going to deflect it. Who's going to deflect it? Whose taxpayers are going to pay? Do you know where it's going to hit? Maybe it's going to hit over there, maybe it's going to hit over there. What I can tell you is that there's a line all the way across the Earth. And if it hits the Earth, it's going to hit somewhere on that line. But that line goes all the way across the planet. So who pays? And in the process, what I'm really doing when I do a deflection is I'm taking an impact point and I'm dragging it along that line until it's off the Earth. Either that way or that way.
Right.
The people who live over here say, drag it that way. The people who live over here say, drag it that way. And over here, we got the president of France who's running for re-election in 2 years. Is he going to give permission for the asteroid to be dragged through France to get it off the edge of the planet? These are the kind of things that we've been working on.
Oh.
Not just the technology, but the geopolitics.
Wow.
And the geopolitics is the toughest nut to crack.
So how many people are involved in the organization? First of all, you don't tell what B612.
Well, B612, you know, we're dealing with asteroids.
Right.
And so when it came, we formed this nonprofit organization. The question immediately, you know, in the process is, what do we name it? And Pete Hutt, an astronomer astrophysicist from Princeton, remembered sort of vaguely that, didn't the Little Prince, Saint-Exupéry's story about Le Petit Prince, or the Little Prince, didn't he come from an asteroid and didn't it have a name? And we sort of looked around. It wasn't a Google then, you know. We looked around, finally found it, and sure enough, his asteroid was B612. So we named our organization the B612 Foundation. But that's a story. So anyway, we've been working ever since. We know what to do. We know how to do it. It is not expensive. And yet we have not been able to, nor have any nations in the world taken full responsibility for this and assigned the responsibility to protect life on Earth to their space agency. NASA, we've gotten far enough that NASA is supposed to find them, which they haven't been doing all that well. They did in the beginning, but now it's slowing down. And they've now gotten the responsibility, after a lot of work that we've done, to develop the technology that would enable a deflection, but they are not assigned the responsibility to do it. They are not assigned the responsibility to protect Americans or anybody else from an asteroid impact.
When I heard that interview with you with Neil deGrasse Tyson, where did I hear that? Was that?
Oh, I have no idea. We've had 5 interviews. You know, I don't know which one.
Well, you were walking on the beach.
Oh, okay. Well, that was a NOVA program 4 or 5 years
A
ago.
long time ago.
Yeah.
Seems like he's the guy to take the lead for you. He's such a
Well,
popular guy.
he's the CEO or the executive director or whatever the hell he is of the Hayden Planetarium. I mean, a planetarium can't take the responsibility. I mean, the fundamental responsibility of government, and I don't care whether it's a communist government or a democracy or a dictatorship or whatever, the fundamental responsibility conceptually of government is security of its people, safety of its population. That's what this is.
And do
This
things.
is the most fundamental thing. Do we or do we not expect our governments to keep us from going the way of the dinosaurs?
And I'm going to close that door.
Yeah.
I don't care what the.
Well, I probably got to get going here
I
too.
got to ask you one more thing.
Yeah. Okay, but the fundamental issue of planetary defense, which is the rubric under which all of this stuff goes, the early warning stuff, finding them, predicting impacts, deflection, making the decision, that whole thing comes under the rubric of planetary defense. The fundamental responsibility for planetary defense has to be governments.
Has to be.
But there are so many immediate things that government deals with. I mean, it's not as bad as a corporation. Most corporations, you're talking about the next quarterly report, or the return on investment over the next year, or whatever it is. Governments, it's every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, but the time horizon is my term in office. When am I going to be held responsible, for? The only entity with the time horizon that matches the challenge here, which is long times between impact, the only entity there is civilization, community, the public, it's people. We're the only ones that have that sense of responsibility for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. So we got to beat on governments to act. I mean, that's what it amounts to. I mean, that's our job as citizens. We're not passengers on this planet. We're crew, and it's our responsibility to ensure that responsibility is taken to, prolong or make indefinite the survival of life on this planet.
I've got to ask you about space adaptation sickness. Can you spend a few minutes talking about that?
Sure.
I know it's been a while, but since you were kind of the focus
Guinea
for,
pig.
Yeah, guinea pig. Because
Yeah.
you were the guy that raised his hand and said,
I did. Right. Well, you have to think back on it. The low point in my life was that third night, I guess it was, the third day on our Apollo mission, and we had activated the LEM that day, the Lunar Module that day. So the batteries are on, as we were talking about earlier, and it was. I had to move around that day for the first time. I had basically, knowing that I could be susceptible to motion sickness, I had basically, because Frank Borman, who barfed on Apollo 8, wouldn't take any tests, all I knew was that if I didn't move around a lot, I would be less likely to get sick. It was clear, everybody knew that moving your head was a stimulus to motion sickness, to malaise, or whatever you want to call it. So the first 2 days, I figured, great, I'll adapt by not triggering the thing by being as still, keeping my head as still as I could. So for the first 2 days of the mission, I didn't move around a lot, and I didn't have to because I was a Lunar Module pilot, and we were activating that later. So, but the day comes, and I'm going to be activating the Lunar Module. Now we got to move around. I found out after it, all I did was postpone adaptation to the worst possible time. Okay, so that morning when I went to put my suit on, which is one challenging maneuver, let me tell you, to get your suit on up there in the confines of that spacecraft, my head came up through the neck ring finally, and I got everything, and it was like, woo, this isn't feeling too good. And shortly after that, I barfed the first time that day. And, you know, you're scrambling for the bag and barf, and it's a mess.
Had you been airsick before?
Oh yeah, sure. Which is why I say I knew that I was somewhat
Sure, okay.
susceptible to motion sickness, but also, I mean, you know, I'm a fighter pilot. You put me in a plane, I'll dogfight and beat the hell out of anybody. So I mean, it's not something which is like always there. But you know, a new environment. You know, I go out to fishing. If I do it, you know, if I've done it 3 or 4 times in a week or something, I'm not going to get sick. But if I haven't done it for 6 months, you know, I might get sick. So I, you know, again, as I say, my solution was to minimize the head motions as long as I could, which simply, it turned out, prolonged and delayed my potential motion sickness until the worst time, which is when I had to start doing things. So, you know, after that first time, it was, I moved a little carefully, got over in the Lunar Module, started doing all the stuff, and checking out everything, and I'm not feeling great, but I'm not, you know, I'm not feeling that sick, but I'm not feeling great. And then McDivitt comes over a little later after an hour or two, and then Jim and I are working away and doing this, that, and the other thing, checking out system by system, you know, all the stuff in the Lunar Module, turning things on, activating them, etc. And halfway through the afternoon of that day, I'm a little ahead of Jim in the checklist, and there was a thing where we had to coordinate our activity. Probably 50%, 70% of it was independent, you know. But there's that 30%, and I got ahead of Jim, so I said, oh, Jim, I'm at step, you know, 45 on page, blah, blah, you know, where are you? And he said, give me 5 minutes, I'll be with you. And I said, oh, great, you know, so, well, now I can relax. As soon as I relax, whoa, what's that? And I had to grab a barf bag again. Okay, so I got sick for the second time, and that was like, whoa. Well, none of us knew anything then, you know? So we finish up with the Lunar Module, we get back in that night, and it's like, we don't know what's going on, but one thing you don't want to do, and everybody knows it, you don't want to get sick outside in a spacesuit.
Oh boy.
I mean, if you think about it just for a minute, there's no gravity, things don't drop, so you barf, and it's all right there, and you can't get your hands to it. You know, it's inside the helmet, your hands are at the end of these things. There's nothing you can do, you drown. Okay, you suffocate. So barf equals die. Well, I mean, McDivitt and I
I
are
think they said
looking
in
at
here
this.
you had to delay an extra hour or so before you went out in your spacewalk.
Well, I mean, we're looking at this. We don't know what's happening. We don't know what's going to happen the next day. But, you know, I don't want to die. McDivitt doesn't want to see me die.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, look, the best thing to do, we're going to cancel the spacewalk tomorrow, but we're going to go right up to the point where we would depressurize and go out, and then we'll pick up the checklist again as if we did the EVA and
Right.
come in. But we're not going to have Schweikart go out there locked up in a suit with a chance of barfing. So we canceled the EVA, and then we said, wow, we're so far behind the timeline anyway. You're always behind the timeline. We're so far behind the timeline, let's take an extra hour of sleep. So we're going to get up an hour later than we would have if we had followed the flight plan. Well, so that night, you know, just think about that. That night, I'm going to sleep in the Lunar Module, and it's like, I don't know if I'm going to barf again. We didn't know if we talked a little bit about, you know, if I continue to be sick, we might have to terminate the mission. Not just not do the EVA, but we might even have to terminate the mission.
But
So
the other guys are okay though.
Yeah. So I go to sleep that night, and it's like, you know, I may be the reason that we don't meet Kennedy's goal of getting a man to the moon and safely back to Earth by the end of the decade. Try going to sleep with that one on your head. okay? But we got up the next morning, didn't sleep much, got up the next morning, went through things, got the suit back on, not a problem. Get over in the Lunar Module, McDivitt comes over, we're starting to go through the checklist as if we're going to do the EVA, all the rest of it. We got to within, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes of when I would go outside, and we had a few minutes, we're out of, you didn't have continuous communication with the ground back then. You remember you had the episodic communication, right? So, we're between ground stations, and Jim looks and says, "You look like you're feeling a bit better today." And I said, "Yeah, I'm feeling a lot better." And Jim says, "Well, let's go another 15 minutes and see what it looks like." Doing this checklist, get everything ready. And we got to that point just before coming up on the ground station, and Jim says, "Well, how you feeling?" I said, "Feeling pretty good." He said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think it's okay." And Jim looked at me. He said, "Yeah, I do too. Houston, we're going ahead with the EVA." And to this day, I credit McDivitt with having made the most courageous command decision that I had ever seen.
With your life.
Both of us. But he looked in my eyes, and he didn't just see that I was looking better, but he could tell, knowing me, that I really felt that it was okay.
When you got back, you went through a lot of tests. In fact, you missed your...
After we got back, the big question was, okay, the only people that we knew of at that time, aside from the Russians, which had some episodes,
right,
was Frank Borman on Apollo 8.
And he didn't want
to talk about it, take any tests, nothing.
Right.
Blamed it on Seconal, and me. And of course I'm saying, hey, I barfed. Yeah, I barfed, right. What do we know? Is it really okay to send 3 people off to the moon when we may end up risking 3 people staying there at the moon? I mean, we didn't know enough. So I said, look, this is important. I'll volunteer to be the guinea pig. And so for the next, I don't know what it was, 6 months or something like that, I went over to Naval Pensacola to the torture chamber, every kind of rotating room, rotating chair, head motion, walking the beam, balance, you name it. I went through it. And we came out at the end of it not knowing a hell of a lot more than we knew before, except a really key thing, which would have made a real difference on Apollo 9, which was that the best way, after spending, hundreds of hours in various torture machines over at NAS Pensacola on motion sickness, basically what we came out of it with was the best way to adapt to weightlessness in terms of not provoking motion sickness is to approach but not pass over the line of melees between what we call melees 1A. I mean, we ended up with a whole bunch of different increasing symptomatology, right? And we would, you would want to go up that mountain to the point where you were feeling bad, but not so far that when you stopped you would barf. So you wanted to approach that point and back off. And approach that point and back off. And that was the best way to adapt, the fastest way to adapt to weightlessness, to where then you could do anything. I mean, it didn't make any difference. Yeah. And that's the same with me. I mean, after that one day when I barfed, I never barfed again. I didn't feel great, but I didn't barf again. I could do anything I wanted. Today, about 40% or more of people who fly end up, barfing. Yeah, so I mean, we know now that it's common. At that time, it was the first time we really had the ability to really move around, unlike Mercury or Gemini. And
well, Joe Engel talked about how because gravity the way it is keeps all the blood up here. So when you go out into space, you're weightless, and so everything wants to come up here. Mm-hmm. And he talked about how you know, they like to show the astronauts having the good old American boy breakfast, the scrambled eggs and all, but that's the wrong kind of, it's too heavy. So he said the best way to go into space was slightly dehydrated. So you're not all filled up.
Well, you know, some people, I mean, it's a tremendous variability in it, and it's not terribly predictable
Really?
based on ground experience. I mean, you know, they're no longer around to do it, but the example that I always gave was Joe Kerwin, who loved weightlessness and flying what we call the vomit comet, you know, the zero-G airplane,
sure.
right? But Joe was fine in the vomit comet, but he would barf on the ramp on the way to it. You know, okay. Ron Evans, who loved it, you know, flying a thing, barfed in space, and you could fly as many parabolas as you wanted with Ron. He never had a problem on the ground, but he ended up barfing on Apollo, whatever it was.
So do people wear patches now?
You know, I've lost track of it. I don't know. I think people have tried. I mean, people try everything. And NASA gives you, you know, a combination of drugs which, on the one hand, suppress the central nervous system to some extent, which inhibits barfing, but at the same time, they have to make sure you're alert. So
Sure,
they give you
right.
something else which
Right.
keeps you alert. And all of that, none of it is because of a real understanding of the stimulus and the biology of why. I mean, nobody knows why we barf. Why do you barf? Because you're bouncing around. Why is that the response to bouncing around? I mean, think about the survival value of barfing. What is that? And nobody really understands that. So it's not because of knowledge. It's like the drug test where you take 1,000 drugs and see what works. And then you say, oh, that's the one. But you don't have any clue why.
Yeah, right.
And that's, in a sense, I mean, it's a little bit better than that, but not a lot. So NASA does, we are able now, we understand adaptation better. So that's a process which is built into flight now. And we have a little bit more experience with certain drugs, which we've kind of come across almost by accident, that do a pretty good job and don't make you sleepy and that kind of thing. But it's very pragmatic, but it's not exactly scientific.